All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our session on Okta's hybrid IT vision and roadmap. I'm Lindsay Bly. I'm on the product marketing team here at Okta, and I'll shortly be joined by Eric Karlinski, who's our Okta Access Gateway product manager. Now, before we jump into our packed agenda, a couple housekeeping items. So we will be available via chat throughout this session and for a few minutes afterwards. If you want to drop some questions in the chat, we will be happy to get back to you as soon as we can. And one other item that I'm sure you're familiar with now is our safe harbor statement. So just a quick call out that this presentation may contain forward-looking statements and refer to the following slides for more information. So for the next 30 to 45 minutes or so, we're going to cover three key things here. First is our vision for hybrid IT. Second is our roadmap for rethinking Active Directory and how our vision for hybrid IT applies to rethinking Active Directory. And then lastly, I'll pass it off to Eric, who will cover our roadmap for Okta Access Gateway. So first, starting with our vision for hybrid IT. Now, if you're in this session, I'm going to go ahead and guess that you as an organization are facing some challenges around hybrid IT, or you're part of the 0.1% who is interested in hybrid IT generally as a topic. The good news is that you as an organization are not alone. In fact, around 70% of organizations out there have some form of hybrid IT in their environments today. And that's because cloud is really a no-brainer when it comes to deploying new initiatives. Cloud models are typically easier to subscribe to, they're easier to use, they provide a more modern user experience, they're more intuitive, the benefits go on, and really where we see companies starting to invest in innovation is not in their on-prem solutions, but really in their new cloud modern solutions. But the reality is you can't just flip a switch and transition from an entirely on-prem environment to a cloud environment overnight. This transition can take organizations years, 5-10 years for some, and can require a lot of resources as well. And so we typically see as organizations are making the journey to the cloud that certain applications remain on-prem for a variety of use cases. Now, there's three key reasons that we typically see for this, and they're kind of outlined here in these three lines. The first is that the application or the system is absolutely critical to how business is done. So think of in the financial services industry, a mainframe is critical for those organizations to actually accomplish their work on a day-to-day basis and is something that will remain on-prem for the foreseeable future. The next item is an indication of how bundled a system or application is with other systems or applications in the environment. So something that is highly bundled with other solutions as part of a suite is going to be a lot harder to remove and replace with a cloud alternative than something that's a standalone application that may not have all the dependencies out there that something in a bundle does. And then the last item here, similar to the previous one, is an indication of how hard it is to actually move that system to the cloud. And that's open standard versus proprietary solutions. So something that's proprietary is going to be highly configured. It's going to have a substantial amount of data in it that will oftentimes be very difficult to move into a more modern cloud application or a more modern solution. And this bar on the bottom, this triangle that goes up, increases as you go to the right, is an indication of how applications are more likely to stay on-prem when you start to approach those variables on the right. Now you'll notice on the slide too that we've colored the first line item, the business criticality of a system, in green, and the other two are in red. And that's because we really think that the only reason an application should remain on-prem, the only real good business reason for this, is because that application or system is delivering business value. It's creating value for an organization. It's integral to the way things are done, and it's really, really critical for that application to remain around so that the business can continue to run. Now, the other two items, while they may hold applications on-prem, are more around how hard it is to actually move that specific solution. And in that case, we don't think that these are good reasons for applications or solutions to really remain on-prem. So let's walk through some examples of different types of solutions out there. The first are ERPs and HRMs. And bringing back those three lines that we just looked at in the previous slide, we can get an indication of these applications are often considered business critical. So think of if you're a manufacturing company, your manufacturing systems might be entirely reliant on SAP's manufacturing module, and there's no way that you're going to move that solution to the cloud anytime soon. Now, oftentimes these systems, not only do they touch large swaths of your organizations and impact in a high volume of users, which requires a lot of change management, but they're often very expensive to move too. So oftentimes moving something like SAP or Oracle to the cloud requires buy-in at the exec level and requires substantial budget and time and resource dedication. The second category I want to touch on are ERP and HRM middleware. So for every Oracle e-business suite out there, there's an Oracle WebLogic or some kind of middleware tying that system together. Because these middlewares aren't necessarily directly impacting how your organization runs or how your employees get work done, they're not necessarily business critical. But as you can see, those two bottom levers on the right are pushed, or on the bottom are pushed all the way to the right. And that's an indication of these applications, while they're maybe not delivering a ton of business value, are really difficult to move because they're so bundled with other solutions and they're so proprietary that reconfiguring, setting those up in a cloud option again, or moving data can be really difficult. The third category are standalone liability systems. And these are systems that at one point delivered value for your organization, but in today's world are actually becoming more of a liability and holding you back from moving forward and adopting modern technology and adopting modern modes of working. Now you'll see on the green arrow, or the green line, is far to the left, which means these aren't delivering a ton of business value. In fact, they might be holding you back. But as that bottom line indicates, there's a ton of proprietary configuration, a ton of proprietary data, a ton of proprietary setup, and how these systems run, which makes it really hard to find a good modern replacement and also actually execute on migrating that to the cloud. And then lastly are standalone and open solutions. These are often things more like open standards, open protocols, where there's a modern solution that is oftentimes better than its existing on-prem solution, easier to deploy, easier to use. And at the same time, these open standards or these protocols don't necessarily have anything proprietary about them and are things that your organization should really think about moving to the cloud. So for these different types of applications and different types of systems, how you treat them as a company will not always be the same, and you're going to need to go through some prioritization effort on what to do for each of these different apps. In the retire bucket, so as an organization moves to the cloud, typically the first things we see retired are productivity apps, things like video, chat. We haven't even called those out here, but most of you have probably already retired those on-prem versions and moved those to the cloud. The next bucket to think about retiring are other areas where solutions and systems are no longer delivering business value, and they actually have modern replacements that can easily be replaced. And so think about things like ADFS or LDAP in these scenarios, those standalone and open apps that should actually be retired in your architecture today. The next strategy is rethinking what's holding you back. So in this bucket, we place those standalone liability apps. And again, these are things that are no longer delivering business value. There are aspects of them that are actually holding back your business growth, but because they're so proprietary, they're really hard to move. Now, when we talk about rethink, that's kind of a vague term, but what we really mean is figure out what are the critical business processes, productivity pieces that these applications are preventing you from achieving, and figure out how you can either replace those with modern solutions or layer something on top of it that will better allow something like Active Directory to adapt to a modern process, maybe like working remotely. And then this last bucket is addressing the reality that we know that there are certain solutions and systems out there today that are just not going to move in the foreseeable future. And these, again, are things that are really business critical. So SAP, Oracle, maybe your mainframe for your financial services organization. It could be 3 to 5 years before you actually even embark upon that project to move it to the cloud. And with that, too, are those supporting systems that are equally as difficult to extract from a bundle. That said, we don't think that you should just let these be on-prem. These applications, as they're being accessed by users and as they're so business critical, should be treated just like a modern application would. And that means providing a modern user experience, making sure your employees can access these easily and in the same manner that they would access something like Zoom or Slack. And at the same time, making sure that these on-prem applications are secured using modern protocols and that they're not relying on legacy security protocols that are maybe not relevant in today's modern work environment. So we're going to switch over and talk a little bit about Active Directory and our roadmap around allowing organizations to retire and rethink different pieces of Active Directory, as Active Directory is probably the most prominent piece of hybrid IT in most organizations today. So for those of you who want a little history lesson, Active Directory was actually created in 1999, which was the same year that the movie Office Space was released. And this is kind of my favorite artifact around how work was actually completed in 1999. So if you look at Milton in this picture, you can see that he's working in an office. He's probably using Windows hardware only and software, and he's probably accessing only on-prem applications, or he's doing all of his work in those files that you see behind him. But the reality is today is 2020, and unfortunately my photo isn't loading, but you all are actually really living the reality of 2020 today. We're all attending a virtual conference. Given the current macro environment, most people are working from home. You need to be mobile. You need to be able to use devices that are maybe not sanctioned by your organization. You also need to be able to access cloud apps. For a lot of us, Zoom has become super prevalent, or applications like Slack that allow us to collaborate with coworkers even when we're not in the office. And then lastly, this notion of extended enterprise. Back in 1999, most work was done by a full-time employee staff or a part-time staff, but we're starting to see an increase in contractors, increase in temporary workers with the advent of the gig economy, that modes of working and the types of people we're working with is starting to change. But the reality is Active Directory was actually designed for that world that Milton from Office Space was living in 1999, and it was built in with some of those assumptions around how work is done and the assumption that that would remain the same for the future. So we're starting to talk to a lot of organizations who are looking at reducing their reliance on Active Directory and starting to figure out which pieces they can remove and which pieces they can start to quote unquote rethink in order to deploy and enable a more modern workforce. So when it comes to let's use those three different strategies again that we talked about previously for approaching hybrid IT, specifically around Active Directory. So things that can be retired from AD today are those more open standards that were kind of an add-on to Active Directory, so ADFS and LDAP, that enabled access to different resources from Active Directory, where there's a modern solution that can provide a replacement today that can be somewhat easily migrated. Now, AD itself is not quite as easy. It's not very easy for most organizations to fully retire AD, so think about those pieces of Active Directory that are maybe holding your org back from adopting those modern work environments that we're living in today. So working remotely, working from home, different devices, cloud applications. Those are the types of things that you want to think about layering in a solution or replacing pieces of Active Directory for. Now, that said, I mentioned that our customers talk to us a lot about reducing reliance on AD. And we are actually able to do this for a subset of organizations that are typically more cloud forward and often smaller. So Okta, for example, internally, we actually don't use Active Directory ourselves. And we have customers that we've helped replace Active Directory for or really reduce the reliance on in general. And a couple of those are speaking at Octane this week. So I would check out that customer session featuring NRC and ThoughtWorks and Zoro. Those three organizations have taken steps using Okta to really reduce their reliance on Active Directory. But the reality is most organizations, especially larger enterprises that have been around for a while, don't look like Okta's IT stack. They weren't created in 2009, so things look a lot different. And this is what a hybrid IT reality might look like in some of those more standard organizations, and you may be living this as well. And in this world, Active Directory is kind of the center of gravity. It's providing access to critical on-prem resources. It's driving access to Microsoft software as well. And you'll see Okta is in the picture, but it's kind of relegated up in the corner to managing access to cloud apps only. And now this is what our goal is to become. We want to become the single source of truth instead of Active Directory, so that you can adopt those newer modern ways of working while still securing your on-prem infrastructure. And in this model, there may be organizations where replacing Active Directory is not something that's a reality, but that's why we want you to rethink what are the important pieces for you to enable via a cloud solution. So things like access to cloud apps, access to your Microsoft apps, access to on-prem apps and resources. Those are things that your organization needs to get their job done in providing modern and secure access to those resources helps you get to a place where you're adapting more modern work environments and you're not kind of beholden to that previous Active Directory model. So we're going to talk a little bit about Okta's roadmap and how it pertains to Active Directory and being able to replace and reduce reliance on it. Now, before I jump into each of these three areas, I do want to call out that this is an aggregation of our different roadmaps from different product managers. So we're kind of just taking things that Okta is doing with an eye on replacing Active Directory and putting them in context of how to reduce reliance on AD specifically. Now, if you have questions on any of these three areas, we have a lot of Octane roadmap sessions this week that will be presented by and monitored by the product managers for each of these specific items. So I would make sure, if you're interested in what we're doing and some of the specifics and details around any of these areas, highly recommend that you attend one of those sessions. So there are three key areas when it comes to replacing Active Directory that we're investing in: applications, devices, and resources. So we'll start out with some of the recent investments that we've made across each of these areas. From an application standpoint, Okta Access Gateway we launched last year, and this product, which Eric will talk about in detail later, will allow organizations to effectively manage access to on-prem applications through Okta without having to rely on Active Directory for authentication. The second category is devices. So we are launching agentless desktop SSO, which I'm personally really excited about. I've spoken with a couple organizations where device level single sign-on was kind of the last thread that was preventing them from entirely moving off of Active Directory. And this is because historically you had to have Active Directory in place in order to enable a device level single sign-on experience. Well, in this scenario, you'll be able to do that with Okta and without reliance or an agent on Active Directory. The other key piece here to call out is our enterprise mobility management integrations. So these are vendors like VMware or solutions like Microsoft Intune that allow you to move your devices and your device management out of Active Directory and into the cloud and start managing devices out that are non-Windows. So you can start to adopt some of the different device types out there. And then lastly, resources. So our LDAP interface, which we released a while back, helps manage resources without reliance on AD. And then a big kind of step here also is advanced server access that allows organizations to manage access to servers directly from Okta without having to rely on Active Directory to do so. Now, where are we making some investments? So this is kind of forward thinking for the next year. And again, I would recommend following up on some of our specific roadmap sessions for each of these if you have questions, but a few pieces I want to call out. On the application side, Eric will talk about some of our Okta Access Gateway enhancements that will make Okta Access Gateway in general easier to use and more applicable to more organizations. He's going to cover that in a few minutes here. The other area I want to call out on the application side is improved O365 management. So we know most organizations out there are using O365 and oftentimes actually have to keep Active Directory around to manage aspects of O365 like GalSync or shared mailboxes. So our goal, our Microsoft Apps team wants to make managing O365 much easier and doesn't think that you should have to have Active Directory sticking around to do this. So they're investing in core capabilities in Okta like being able to manage GalSync from Okta and being able to manage shared inboxes from Okta that will allow you to kind of move that management and functionality out of Active Directory and into a more modern tool. The second area is around devices. So we announced the release of Okta FastPass this week, which is an improved single sign-on passwordless experience for end users. We're also investing in device visibility in Okta, so you'll no longer have to go into AD to see which devices are accessing which resources, and instead in Okta you'll have full visibility into devices that your users are accessing your resources with. And then lastly, endpoint detection and response integrations. Not necessarily something that was core to Active Directory itself, but these integrations will provide more context when Okta is making decisions around access, which will inherently make moving some of these applications and devices to Okta itself a more compelling use case. And then lastly, resources. So today we have Advanced Server Access, which allows you to manage access to servers from Okta. It does a really great job at managing access for new deployments, but we're making investments to make it better and easier to manage existing deployments of servers. And so one key area that we're investing in is the ability to master server accounts in Okta. And we'll do this by adding additional attributes to Okta, including GID and UID. And then lastly, our team's investing in support for domain joined users, as we know you all have a lot of domain joined server accounts. So not only will these investments allow you to kind of move your center of gravity from Active Directory to Okta, but also they should help organizations start to reduce the reliance on those parts of Active Directory that are holding them back and adopt some of those more modern modes of working. Again, mobility, working remote, working with different devices, working with different types of extended users. And in addition to that, we think that organizations will be able to directly impact their Active Directory environment through things like reducing MIM usage, potentially retiring AAD Connect, reducing PowerShell in certain use cases, and overall reducing the on-prem infrastructure that they have around to maintain Active Directory for some of these use cases. From a rethink standpoint, this will depend on from organization to organization, but essentially we think that we can get organizations to a place where they can replace Active Directory as the center of gravity, and in those scenarios, adopt and secure more of their modern and also legacy technology in the process of doing so. All right, and to cover this last bucket on enabling and securing those applications that you aren't going to retire or rethink and instead will kind of stay for the foreseeable future, I'm going to pass it over to Eric Karlinski.
Thank you, Lindsay. So Lindsay set it up great. When we're talking about hybrid IT, there's kind of three categories of applications we look at. There are some that you want to modernize and retire the old versions. There are some that you want to rethink, and there are some that are going to stay. And so the way that Access Gateway fits in is it's a new product for us, which I'll talk about, and it helps you to address that last bucket, which are the applications that'll stay. So just to set things up from an Access Gateway perspective, our vision at Okta, if we zoom out a little bit, is to manage access to everything, right? We started with SaaS applications and we've branched out beyond that, and we want to extend to connect to everything that's important to make your organization run, whatever company that is. And so the focus of Access Gateway is really around custom applications and on-premises applications. So for those on-premises applications and custom applications, let's get more specific about what those are. So I'm going to borrow Lindsay's visual again. So we have these three bars. On the top, we have a spectrum of no business value to driving business critical processes. And then there's applications that are members of a bundle versus those that are standalone and those that are open standard or proprietary. And this bucket really contains applications like Oracle PeopleSoft and HRM technologies, or e-business suite, or business applications that are highly business critical, that if they went down, your business would be severely impacted, that may or may not be part of a bundle, but also are heavily proprietary. So they don't necessarily support open standards like SAML, and if they do, then there's a whole stack of technologies that are required to sort of enable that and light that up. And this is where Access Gateway comes in. So Access Gateway wants to extend Okta to take those legacy applications that are web-based, like SAP and Oracle E-Business Suite, and even custom portals that you're building or basing on SharePoint and other portal technologies, and give you that Okta-like experience. And the way that we do that is by here we are, found the next button. The way that we do that is by supporting additional standards or patterns, really. These are not standards per se, but they're common patterns that we see in on-premises web applications. So for example, Kerberos authentication, header-based authentication, and Windows or integrated Windows authentication, which is usually facilitated by Active Directory. So by supporting these new standards, we're able to connect to these applications. But there's another thing that's different about Access Gateway, which I'll get into in the architecture discussion in a second. And so let's talk about the product and what it does today. So the vision for Access Gateway is, again, to extend the power of Okta, everything that Okta does, to those legacy web applications. So everything from the adaptive multi-factor authentication to SSO. And the way that it works is that Access Gateway gets deployed on premises or on the edge of your network. It communicates with Okta, and it serves as a proxy for the applications behind it. And that allows it to support those non-standard patterns and also provide extra security to those applications. That helps to deliver Okta SSO and adaptive MFA to those apps. If we zoom in on the architecture a little bit more, what we can see is let's look at how Access Gateway is deployed. So what I have here is I'm showing Access Gateway is being deployed on the network boundary. This is a simplification, but basically it can be deployed in a DMZ. It can be deployed on an internal network and the firewall configured such that it's internet accessible, but that's the key, that it's accessible over the internet. It communicates to Okta for all the user information, and then it proxies requests to the backend applications. And the effect of this is that for the end user, so we have the end user in the top left here, the purple lines show what's actually happening, and the green line shows what the user perceives. So starting with the green line, it appears to the user that they're logging in directly to this application that's actually on premises and not internet exposed. That app server is not exposed to the internet. What's actually happening is that request is going through Access Gateway and then routed to that on-premises application. And Access Gateway also proxies the responses back from the application to the user. So Access Gateway is basically impersonating the end user. This is called a reverse proxy architecture. And this is how we're able to support things like HTTP header-based authentication. So let's look at header-based, for example. The way a header-based works in this architecture is that the user will log into the application and will prompt the user for authentication. And because we know that the user needs to be authenticated to access this application, before the user ever even gets access to anything in the application, Access Gateway can reroute requests to the Okta Cloud. The user is then prompted by Okta to do authentication and or multi-factor authentication, and they're coming back to Access Gateway. And then since Access Gateway is proxying requests to that backend application, we can also insert identity information into the HTTP payload or the headers so that that application, when it checks the headers for that information, gets the authoritative information from Okta and is delivered in a secure way from Access Gateway. And that's how we're able to support header-based authentication, for example. So being a proxy and being in line with these applications gives us a ton of opportunities to do some really interesting things. And it's beyond just access. So some other examples of what we can do is we can be configured to handle very really advanced on-premises use cases, such as we can handle multi data centers and multi-tenancy within your on-prem environment much better than in the past. We can support on-premises data sources also to augment what Okta has about the identity with additional data from your local data stores. We support things like maintenance mode and failover, anonymous access or public access to applications that are traditionally on premises, and then per app session security as well. And I'll talk a little bit more in the roadmap about what we're doing to double down on that inherent advantage that we have, which leads me to the roadmap for Access Gateway. So when I talk about the roadmap, I think about it in terms of goals. And there are really three goals that we're focused on for Access Gateway in 2020. The number one goal is to make deployment as simple as possible. The number two goal is to evolve the admin experience to make it best in class. And number three goal is to add key new features to really double down on the opportunity that being inline as a reverse proxy gives us. And so it's important to note that these goals are in order of priority. So our number one priority for this year, and you'll see it reflected in our plans, is to make deployment as simple as possible. Now, Access Gateway, as I mentioned, is an on-premises appliance. It gets deployed on your premises in your data center or in your infrastructure as a service provider. And traditionally, those things have been difficult to deploy because you have to manage all kinds of networking configurations. You have to set up high availability yourself. You don't get like those inherent cloud SaaS benefits. While some of that's still going to remain true just by virtue of the fact that it's on premises, we want to make it as simple as possible to deploy Access Gateway and much more in line with deploying Okta generally and what our customers expect. So that's what number one's all about. And if we zoom in on that, how do we think about making deployment simple? Well, some capabilities that we want to deliver some of these have already been delivered actually. So self-service high availability configuration. Now our customers can set up high availability cluster in just a couple of commands in a few minutes directly within Access Gateway, and it's all managed locally. But also things like improving the ability to do logs and forwarding that to the right places and integrating that with your SIEM and others. Doing easier backup and restore the configuration of access gateways, better networking configuration, monitoring, things like that. In addition, by the end of the year, we'll have a supported version of Access Gateway that works for all the leading infrastructure as a service platforms, from Azure to Google Cloud to Amazon Web Services and Oracle, and of course, including VMware and on-premises solutions as well. So just to be clear about this last point, Access Gateway is deployed as an OVA or an open virtual appliance today. And that means it can work on any of these platforms, but there are a couple steps that need to happen to prep that image to be mounted. And we want to get rid of those steps and make it easier to deploy on those platforms. And that's what's coming in the future. Now, number 2 is around evolving the administrative experience. And the idea here is that instead of configuring Access Gateway locally on the appliance itself, we want to move all that configuration to the cloud. And that's going to be a journey. And so this year is all about planning and doing some prototyping and beta testing for some of those capabilities. So the first thing you'll see is our plan to reduce the on-premises administrative UI. So there is an admin web UI for OAG today. We want to reduce that. We're also going to deliver a plan to introduce automation interfaces. This is something that customers and partners, if any of you have experience with Access Gateway already, then you probably encountered some limited API support with Access Gateway, and we want to expand that greatly to give you the opportunities to automate deployment of OAG and setting up of applications a lot more easily and quickly. And finally, log forwarding and downloading UI, and adding modern UIs for setting up logging and backups. All right, now, just because we're focused on making deployment simple and evolving the admin experience this year as priorities 1 and 2, it doesn't mean we're not going to take the opportunity to add key features. And one example of this is step up MFA in a single application. And I'll talk more about that on the next slide. Another thing we're doing is expanding our policy and app documentation. You can write really granular and specific policies in Access Gateway, and we want you to be empowered to do that on your own, and we're going to do that through better documentation. But what do I mean around step up MFA? So step up multi-factor authentication, if you bear with me as I explain this slide. So on the left-hand side, we have page sensitivity, and the top is the highest sensitivity, and the bottom is just a public page, like your home page. So you can see /home would be an example of public. As the user navigates from the left to the right, they get to more and more sensitive areas. So one example would be they want to go to a posts area of your site, and they want to go to an admin area of your site ultimately. Or another example would be in green, you go to a store area of the site, and then eventually you want to make a purchase and perform e-commerce. And so as you step up to these levels of sensitivity, you want to have different layers of security and more strength and stringent required authenticators. And so a common request we get from customers is, within this application, if they go to a specific area of the application, I want to prompt them for multi-factor authentication at that point. And because Access Gateway is a reverse proxy, and because we handle all of the requests and responses from that application, it's a unique opportunity to do that. So we're going to add that capability into the product this year. So how does that play out on the calendar view, though? So just to give you guys a very specific view, and apologies for FY21, that's our fiscal year. I had the calendar year at the bottom pegged to February 1st, 2020, which is that green line. So as I talk through that, please use that as a point of reference. So how are we going to improve deployment unity and also innovate on OAG this year? So as of February 1st, we've already shipped the ability to do self-service high availability configuration. So that's done. The next on the docket, which are in development now and should be delivered imminently, are log forwarding and downloading, so the ability to download logs and set up log forwarders on OAG, self-service backup and restore, and advanced networking configurations. One thing we learned when we launched Access Gateway is that customers' networking environments vary widely, and they need a lot of control about how they're setting up appliances to work in those environments. And so we're adding additional enhancements to our ability to support those networks. In Q2, you'll also see enterprise-grade monitoring, adding us to an AWS marketplace and more support from more infrastructure as a service providers. And then towards the second half, more features around improving our certificate management, troubleshooting tools, and expression language. So everything that you're seeing here is in that first theme. That's why they're all blue. And you can see on the top right, there's a key that says these are all deployment-based features. The next, I'll talk through the admin features. So these are the green ones, and you can see that our target for delivering that plan for moving the app config to the cloud is Q1. We want to have a beta in Q2 of moving the app configuration to the cloud, and we're hoping to GA app configuration by the end of the year. We also are hoping to beta additional cloud configurations such as backup and restore and sync by the end of the year as well. And then finally, those new features, we're really not going to start work on those until the second half of this year, because again, this is the third of 3 priorities. But Step Up MFA is at the top of that list, and I have a couple other ones listed here as potential options behind that. The support for multiple app backends, better mutual TLS between OAG and the applications, for example. The gray box that you see there is FedRAMP Moderate. We're going to be working on this throughout the year, but we have a goal of achieving FedRAMP Moderate accreditation by the end of the year for Access Gateway, and we have to put all the systems and controls into place in order for that to be the case. So that's the near-term view of the next year for Access Gateway, and I hope that helps you understand where we're going with the product and what you're going to see from us in the next year. Now I want to talk a little bit more about the long-term view, the future of Access Gateway. When I think about the future of Access Gateway, it's really, again, simplifying everything and also taking advantage of our position as a reverse proxy. So the first area that you're going to see investments is around cloud-based administration. The second area you're going to see is around continuous authorization, really doubling down on continuously authorizing the user to access resources within an application that's protected. And then also we're going to be adding more applications and potentially more resources that are on your premises today and tying those back into Okta through Access Gateway. So let's talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. So around cloud-based administration, again, this is a futuristic view. It's going to be a journey over the next couple of years, but it's about consolidating all of the configuration admin interfaces that are on Access Gateway today and moving them to the cloud. But we're not just doing this for aesthetics, right? There's good reasons for this and good benefits. One is that it provides a cohesive and modern admin experience, which helps eliminate errors and reduce manual tasks. It also allows Access Gateway to benefit more from platform investment. So as we continue to invest in the Okta platform and all these other roadmaps that you're seeing across the conference, all those benefits will be able to be used and adopted more quickly by Access Gateway and brought down to those on-premises applications. By contrast, investments that we make in Access Gateway will also benefit other products in the platform. So sort of putting on that platform thinking hat and taking advantage of those investments in the best way possible. It also will include APIs to improve automation of Okta Access Gateway and setup and management of Access Gateway. Now, when I think about continuous authorization, I get really excited about this one because really this is about an evolution from long-lived sessions to continuously enforce access policies, which I have in that blue box on the left there. So what this means is how this plays out is basically the user gets seamless access while context is static. So they log in, they authenticate, they're navigating around your website, and as long as everything still looks good and the context hasn't significantly changed, they're just going to get seamless access, so they're not interrupted. Now, the moment anything changes with regards to their context, you need to reinforce policy just like that to improve security. And if needed, Okta can help the user achieve the required assurance through remediation flows such as multi-factor authentication. And I have a diagram here on the bottom that kind of highlights this, but basically at the point of a context change, OAG, because again, it's facilitating every single HTTP request, can instantly kick the user out to Okta to allow them to perform multi-factor authentication when any bit of the context changes. And we need to support that with policy, et cetera, but that's the future of Access Gateway. Now, why would we do that? Well, one, the obvious is that it helps prevent session hijacking. If someone steals your session, the context is going to change and they're going to have to be thwarted from exploiting that because they won't be able to perform multi-factor authentication in a lot of cases. But it also increases generally the number of policy enforcement moments that we have. If we're continuously authorizing and it's done invisibly, so it's not disrupting the user, but each of those is an opportunity to enforce policy again and again and to just continuously reassure Okta that the user is valid. It also improves sensitivity to risk factors and reduces false positives. So because we're checking constantly to see that the context hasn't changed, we actually don't end up having to prompt the user as often as we would have in the past. It sounds like continuous authorization might be continuously prompting the end user, but if done well, it means that you can have very, very long session times, because if that context isn't changing, then you have no really good reason to prompt the user again. So it can lead to a better user experience too. So those are two of our areas of investment. Sorry, let me go back to that slide. So those are two of our areas of investments looking forward into Access Gateway and into the future. So we're really excited about where this is going to take us. There are very general directions, and that's why we don't have dates around these, and they're more long term. But we do want to give you an idea, and we want to work with you to figure out how to best take advantage of these opportunities that we have with Access Gateway. And those are some areas that we're headed. So to wrap things up, some of the takeaways we want you to leave with today is our vision at Okta is to enable you to control access from cloud to ground with Okta, and that expands everything that's in your environment. Access Gateway adds the ability to incorporate on-premises and custom on-premises web applications. On Rethink AD, we're ramping up our investments across the board to reduce your reliance on limitations caused by legacy technology. So the way that we're approaching this problem is there are certain things that are going to stay, there are certain things that should be rethought, and Okta wants to position itself to meet the needs of the future and also meet customers where they are to support those on-premises applications, but without having to make the same compromises as some of the legacy providers like Active Directory. And finally, with Okta Access Gateway, we're making securing hybrid IT as easy as possible. And Access Gateway extends Okta's benefits to more on-premises applications, so you don't have to do an all big bang migration into the cloud. We want to support you on your journey, and we want to make that as easy as possible, which is what we're focused on with our roadmap this year, to make deployment and administrative experience as easy and simple as possible. So with that, I want to leave some time for questions. So you guys have been asking questions throughout, and we're going to answer those in the chat. And we also want to recommend a handful of sessions that you can look at for more information. So one is tracking complex identity problems with workflows. There's another roadmap around security. If you're interested in the continuous authorization portion of this presentation, there's a lot more of that in the security roadmap. A customer story from AAA. The future of device identity and how when you get rid of Active Directory, you have to now come up with a way to secure the devices and to use device context in making an access decision, and how you can do that with Okta going into the future. Modernizing the enterprise with Universal Directory, and then adapting to the cloud operating model. So with that, I want to thank you guys very much for your attention. Thank you for attending Oktane 20 Live. And if you want to ask us any questions that you didn't ask already, you can find us at the booth, at the hybrid IT booth or workforce identity booth, which is part of the Okta virtual booth. Thank you again.